Good evening and welcome to the second season of Literature Berks. My name is Amanda Hornberger and I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks, and I'm the co-chair of Literature Berks. On behalf of our entire committee, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this series of programs. Literature Berks is a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks in partnership with the Exeter Community Library and Sinking Spring Public Library and the Jewish Book Council. We would not be here tonight without the help and support of those organizations, their boards, and staffs. In the chat, you'll see a link to purchase a signed copy of Saving Free Speech from Itself through our official book vendor, Reads & Company Bookshop. Literature Berks is happy to support a local independent bookstore, and we encourage you to continue to shop local during this time. Remember that books always make great gifts. Bane Rosenbaum is an essayist, law professor, and author of the novels such as How Sweet It Is, The Stranger Within Sarah Stein, The Golems of Gotham, Secondhand Smoke, and Elijah Visible. His articles, reviews, and essays appear frequently in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, LA Times, CNN, Haaretz, Huffington Post, and Daily Beast, among other national publications. He serves as a legal analyst for CBS News Radio and as a columnist for the Jewish News Syndicate. He moderates an annual series of discussions on culture, world events, and politics at the 92nd Street Y called The Talk Show. Mr. Rosenbaum is a distinguished university professor at Touro College, where he directs the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society. If you have questions during presentation, I ask that you put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to them after the presentation. Please join me in welcoming Bane Rosenbaum to Literature Berks.
Thanks so much, Amanda. Excuse me. Thank you. Hello, everyone from Southeast Pennsylvania. It's nice to be here. Thank you for coming out. Thank you for supporting Jewish books. Thank you for supporting books itself. Let me see if I can entertain and enlighten you for the next 35 minutes or so, and we'll take some questions. And it's a shame I don't get to see your faces, but you'll be seeing at least mine for 35 minutes. I think there's an enormous amount of confusion nowadays about free speech. I don't think people even understand what it means anymore. For instance, we know that the alt-right in Charlottesville received a court order protecting them to assemble and march and with tiki torches and camouflage gear and chant, "Jews will not replace us." We know that the Constitution protects the KKK from burning a cross on African Americans' lawns. We know that in 1977, federal courts protected neo-Nazis to march on a small enclave of Holocaust survivors in a suburb of Chicago, all guaranteed under free speech, freedom of assembly under the First Amendment. And yet, there's these conflicts. But makes one wonder, well, if that's free speech, and by the way, that's what I would argue to be extreme free speech. And in my book, I talk about where I wouldn't have permitted any of those moments of freedom of expression, and I'll explain why. But we live in an atmosphere where, if you've been following what's going on campuses with safe spaces and trigger warnings and microaggressions, shouting down of speakers, especially if they're a pro-Israel speaker. I'm one of those, and I can tell you I've been shouted down at least 3 or 4 dozen universities. Many of them are state schools, and they're obligated to follow the free speech principles of the First Amendment. And yet on campuses, we're seeing time and again ways in which speech is being hindered. There's some amazing anecdotes. Even recently, 3 different professors were subject to some ethics review grievance because they didn't know each other in 3 different locations. They were reading out loud the N-word. One was a professor reading from Martin Luther King. Another was reading from an essay by James Baldwin. And the third was just reading some rap lyrics. And just the mere mentioning of the N-word in a classroom resulted in investigation and some kind of disciplinary action. This is utter madness. You can't read from the writings of Martin Luther King. Whatever happened? How is that not censorship? We saw this with Colin Kaepernick, right? If you're a football fan, it's confusing. What happened? A few years ago, he invoked what he thought was his First Amendment rights By the way, there's no First Amendment right in a private setting. I'll talk about that a little moment too. The First Amendment only really applies if the government stops you from doing something. It's not really if your employer stops you from doing something. And in this instance, NFL owners decided, because the fans decided, that they didn't want to see the football players taking a knee during the playing of the national anthem. Many people said that that was an infringement on freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. Now we're seeing in the aftermath of the Black Lives Matter movement that all of a sudden you can take a knee. And the NFL is now apologizing that you weren't able to take a knee before. Why now, not then? If we really believe that we have absolutely unfettered freedom of speech, even if it's not the government, then we should all accept the fact that we tolerate our other people's point of view under the principle of freedom of speech, even if the government's not involved. We just respect it. But that's not true, because Roseanne Barr lost her show, Roseanne, because of an errant tweet that had racial overtones. Nobody said, well, she's a comedian, and a crass comedian, often foul-mouthed comedian. Yeah, she popped off on a tweet and insulted an African-American official in the Obama administration. It's a terrible thing to do. But no one said she's a comedian. No one said she had a free speech right, and that the principle of freedom of speech, she was fired. The owner of the Los Angeles Clippers, his football team, his basketball team was taken away from him because of something that was a private recording that was made by his mistress, in which he used very, racist language, and the NFL owners deprived him of his property. People could say, look, this is disgusting. He's a terrible person for this, but he's got the freedom of speech, right? I mean, got the First Amendment right to speak freely, openly. And there's just endless examples of this in our culture. A Google engineer was fired because he wrote an inter-office memo raising the question about why there may be fewer women engineers in the software business. He was fired 2 days later. Couldn't even raise the question. He was shocked. He thought, well, this whole place is filled with PhDs, and we could argue these ideas. He was presenting some data. There was no discussion. He was fired. And so we're seeing more and more of this. And I think the most recent example, in my mind, the most revealing and most pathetic, is what happened with the New York Times a month ago. You may recall, it ultimately shook up the entire editorial staff on the op-ed page. But they ran an op-ed by Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, yes, conservative Republican, who said that in order to quell the violence that are some of the offshoots of the Black Lives Matter movement, that the military should be brought in. There's a federal statute that allows that. In fact, that's how, if you may remember, in the 1960s, that's how you integrated universities and allowed African Americans to enter these universities. It was required, it wasn't martial law, but it's federal legislation that allows for the military to play these roles to aid, to quell violence and to make sure that the law is being applied. And so there was an example where the military was allowed to be brought in to help integrate these universities of the Deep South in public schools. But the mere question of maybe we should bring in the military to quell the violence with Black Lives Matter, if you followed it, but you can go look it up after this is over. The editor of the op-ed page had to resign. All the people that worked on the essay were reassigned, and Barry Weiss, who was on the staff, quit. All as punishment in response to an op-ed, an opinion piece by a United States senator, who, by the way, was remarking on an idea that 62% of the American public believed made sense in order to quell the violence, was considered beyond morally and beyond the pale. And so The New York Times withdrew from, they apologized for the op-ed. They said it was riddled with mistakes. They never say that about other op-eds, but here there was. So that just doesn't look like robust free speech. Let me tell you what the Founding Fathers wanted. The Founding Fathers were interested in a marketplace of ideas. They didn't use those words, but it's what it meant. There wasn't, in the days of the founding of the country and the drafting of the Constitution, we didn't have the internet, obviously. We didn't have television, we didn't have radio. And so they believed in a public square. And the purpose of the public square is for people to come and have debates on the big ideas of the time, of the day. And that it would advance science, culture, governance, by having the best ideas presented and challenged and rebutted and argued persuasively in a mutually respectful way. Didn't mean there couldn't be shouting, but it was different from shouting down, where people were willing to hear the other side. And we don't live in a culture anymore that allows the other side. We live in what's now called the cancellation culture. If you say the wrong thing or don't say it in the way I like it, I will claim, especially if you're a minority or if you're a woman or you're a member of the LGBT community, that you should be canceled, or the word is sometimes used, deplatformed. You should be fired. And we see this all the time. Fired. No explanation, you're gone. This, to me, looks like a fascist society. This, to me, does not resemble anything like the Founding Fathers believed. They thought that ideas are up for grabs, and so therefore present them. And those with the most persuasive ideas will benefit all of us, including the government, which will probably become better decision makers, with having the benefit of the public coming and expressing their desires and why they want what they want, or why they dislike what they. Remember, this was all very much in response to what happened to the American colonies during King George III, who didn't let them say anything. Everything was sedition to King George III. And you know what? In our world of political correctness, intersectionality, critical race theory, the politics of identity, those terms of art, which are you hear on campus, they've also invaded our mainstream media, publishing, even our museums. That is not in any way open to debate. It is the same idea. It's sedition. If you say the wrong word, if you say it in a way that upsets someone, you're gone. We literally cancel you. And that's what the term of art, if you haven't read it, the cancellation culture, that's what it means. Happens all the time. It's mostly fueled through Twitter and social media. What happened in the New York Times, 800 employees sent a letter to the publisher and said, we are protesting this op-ed. And instead of him saying, well, this is a newspaper and you don't get to protest an op-ed because we believe in expressing different opinions. And how did you get to work here at the New York Times if you didn't already know that? That's what he should have said. They should have said, and you know what? You're fired. You're fired because you obviously don't know what the First Amendment means, and you don't know what freedom of the press means. So I don't know how you got in here, but you got to go. We need to hire. There's a lot of other people out there who are much smarter than you and understand what the First Amendment is. But instead, what you're seeing increasingly is everyone living in utter fear of this wave that we're seeing more and more of. We're seeing it in our political culture. We're certainly seeing it on cable news. Universities are completely infected with it. I would advise you don't send your children to them because, and if you're a donor of university, give your money to the Federation. It's a much better place. Universities are not open, intellectually honest places anymore. They're just not. They're anti-intellectual and they're illiberal. And what it meant to be a democracy is to be liberal. Let me tell you what liberalism is. It means to be open. It's that I can hold two different ideas and I could not panic. I don't have to gnash my teeth down to chiclets. Your neighbors are like this, right? If you said anything that they don't want to hear, they go crazy, especially if it's about President Trump. People go crazy. They've lost their mind. A liberal is someone who can calmly hear two arguments and look at them both. And they even say, You've given me something to think about. I'm going to go home and give it some thought. And I'll come back to you. I probably won't even agree with you, but I'm going to think about it. Who talks like that anymore? I don't know anybody. Right now, what you hear is people screaming at each other, deplatforming each other, canceling each other, and treating them with moral ostracism, social ostracism, moral revulsion. It's not, I disagree with you anymore. It's, you are a war criminal. I know this because I'm oftentimes referred to in this way. It's not that people don't agree with me. It's that if I said something they didn't like, I'm a war criminal and I have no right to exist. It's very different. And I can tell you that our founding fathers, John Adams, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, they would be shocked, literally shocked. They'd be embarrassed, shocked, especially at a university that this goes on, speakers being shouted down, professors being investigated for using the wrong word, assigning the wrong book, right? This is not the world of liberalism, certainly not the one that I learned when I was in school. And it's been a long time since I've been in school. And then I've spent most of my life and in university. So I really know what I'm talking about. I've seen this really up close and personal. And this is no joke. This is very serious. And that's why I'm calling attention to this in many ways in this book. But it's a conflict, right? We know what happened in Europe with the Mohammed cartoons, the Danish cartoons first in the Danish newspaper, and then Charlie Hebdo, the magazine in France. Remember that? Islamists killing people because the Prophet Muhammad, can't be drawn in any way, even though the drawings were intended to be ideas laden. They weren't just mockery. There was ideas as a critical, taking critical looks as Islam, not as a religion, but as a political philosophy. Because remember, Islam is very unlike the other religions. It is both, Muhammad was a general and a prophet. People forget that. He was a general and a prophet. Political Islam is real. It's not just in Iran. It's all throughout the Persian Gulf and the Middle East. It's Islam that's also a set of political principles, which, as you've heard, the goal for those who believe in Sharia law is to impose a caliphate, right, which is completely religious. So you see all these examples of well, you couldn't possibly draw a cartoon of Muhammad because you'd get your throat slit, or you'd be bombed. Many of you, I think, have come to New York City. No one comes anymore because of the pandemic, but there was a time people came here to see shows. And you've probably seen the Book of Mormon, right? It's a funny musical. It really beats up all over Mormon, religion. On opening night in Broadway, I have this anecdote in my book. It's one of my favorite anecdotes. On opening night, on opening night, the Playbill magazine, as you know, had the following ad that said, "You've seen the play, now come to the church." As if we're able to hear it. We're able to hear it in this way. So this is sort of a way of sort of setting up this discussion. Let me just say that with respect to neo-Nazis and Klansmen and alt-right, violent, protesting in a way that is intended to be intimidating, inciting, threatening. We are not the only democracy in the world. The European democracies are also based on the cradle of the humanist philosophers, right? The enlightened philosophers of the 18th century: Locke, Rousseau, Hume, Kant, even Jefferson, you could say. They've read the same books. We've all read the same books, and we've all created constitutions that have various level of principles that are based on those enlightened texts. None of those countries would tolerate any of the stuff we do. In Germany and Austria, if you're a neo-Nazi and you want to march with the swastika, we watch you straight to jail. He goes, here we go, march away, straight to jail. There's a comedian in Paris, his name is Mbala Dieudonné. And his act is he gets up there and he says, "Don't you think we should have gas chambers back for the Jews? Wasn't it much better when we could gas them? In fact, let me give you the names of some Jews who should go into that. This is his material, right? He gets pulled off stage and he's arrested. Why are we different? What makes us so special that we think that those who are not introducing ideas, but they're really there to incite, to intimidate, to strip people of their feeling of belonging, welcomeness, citizenship? One of my favorite anecdotes in the book is from Lyndon Johnson, former president in the 1960s, who said, "A man has the right to go outside of his house with his children without being humiliated." He's right about that. A Muslim should not have to explain to his children what the sign means, towel heads go home. No, there's no idea there. That's clearly there to incite, to create hate, to intimidate, and again, to deprive people of the basic principles of what it means to be a citizen. Obviously the same principle. Cross burning, here's one. Do you think that George Washington, as you know, we all know who the father of our country, who was first the general of our country, led this improbable victory against the British army? If you told him in 1796 that the Constitution would protect the burning of the American flag in front of a family that lost a son in combat, he would think you're out of your mind. You would say, that's not what we mean by free speech. That's there to really cause harm. That is a harm-producing event. That is an act of verbal violence, signage violence. There's no other way of looking at that. That's words or gestures used as weapons. And, you know, that is definitely not protected under the Second Amendment either. That is the weapons that we would not want to allow to be used in our civilized society. But those rules are there in the book. One of what I consider the worst of the Supreme Court decisions that was decided in the last decade or so, a little more. But I spent a lot of time in the book talking about it because it's emblematic of these themes. It's called titled Snyder versus Phelps. The Supreme Court, 8-1, only Justice Alito was on the other side. By the way, the First Amendment, these issues of freedom of speech, oddly enough, this is the one area where liberals and conservatives all agree with each other. This is not one where there's a tremendous amount of conflict. We consider ourselves special because of not just the freedom of speech, but the way we implement freedom of speech. So that's why this case, what I'm about to tell you about, 8-1, everybody but one justice believed that a homophobic church group in Kansas that is opposed to gays serving in the military have a constitutional right to travel around the country, get permits at the funerals of dead Marines, and protest within eyesight of the families that are burying their children with signs that says, God hates fags, God hates you, God likes 9/11. And more signs. This is a constitutional principle now. Snyder versus Phelps, 8-1. Chief Justice Roberts lectured us. Don't we understand what the First Amendment is? I think this is nuts. No, I don't think that's what the First Amendment is. And again, I will say, the United States is comprised of outliers. We are not typical. None of these other countries would do they wouldn't allow this. By the way, that case is even especially obnoxious in my view, because it's not a situation where the government, remember I told you earlier, the First Amendment really only applies if the government stops you from doing something. So for instance, when two friends are sitting at a corner on a park bench and they start getting in an argument and someone says, stop talking, I don't want you to keep saying that, it's upsetting me, and stop talking. The other one says, what do you mean? I have a First Amendment right to say what I want, it's a free country. That's not actually true. That's not what the First Amendment's there. It's not there for two people having an argument. You know, you should show each other mutual respect, and the First Amendment doesn't protect you. It doesn't do anything for you. It has nothing to do with you. If the government stopped you from speaking, not your friend saying you're hurting me or I have the right to speak, that is not how the First Amendment works. In this case, it wasn't the government denying the church group a permit. They got the permit. It's that in state court, I think it was in Kansas, or it was maybe in Maryland, I can't remember, where the father sued the church group and for the intentional infliction of emotional distress. He said that he and his family were destroyed by this act. And a state court jury awarded him several $1 million. And because it was done in a courtroom, this civil remedy, they treated it as if it was a violation of the First Amendment, because the court, and eventually, is the one that prevented them from, or would have prevented them from protesting in this manner. The Supreme Court reversed, took back the money, gave it back to the church group, and guess what? They ended up charging the father, ended up paying the legal fees of the church. You know, it's just twisted. And again, the Europeans would never do this. Let me tell you why they wouldn't do this. There's one word that does not appear in the United States Constitution or in the Declaration of Independence, our founding documents. Lots of words are in there, but you know, one word that's not: dignity, human dignity. What does it mean to be treated like a human being, to be dignified, treated with respect and honor and the basic courtesies of what citizenship should provide? The Europeans, and by the way, the Israeli, it's not a constitution, it's the basic laws of Israel. Israel doesn't have a constitution, but they have these basic laws, so you can think of them like the Bill of Rights. In Israel, the Bill of Rights are called the basic laws. One of the basic laws, they don't even have one for free speech, but they have one for human dignity. The Germans, remember this constitution was drafted after the Holocaust, every provision says the word dignity, because you know they understand what happens when you take away the dignity of a citizen. In France, they are so obsessed with human dignity that it's a national crime to throw a dwarf. You know, you see the movie the Wolf of Wall Street. You toss a dwarf into a target area. In France, that's a crime. You're not allowed to do it. Why? Even if the dwarf wants to do it, the society won't permit it. Why? It strips them of their dignity. This is how important the French take that word. You may remember a number of years ago, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, he was the head of the World Bank. He was rumored to be the next president of France. He was in New York. There was an incident with a chambermaid, a maid in the hotel. Clearly some sexual activity took place. It's not clear what happened. They ended up not bringing charges against him. But he was taken off of a plane, first class, from Air France. He was running for office. It would be like Joe Biden, right? Could you imagine if Joe Biden or any presidential candidate was visiting France, and then the police came and pulled him off the plane and did the perp walk, you know, so everyone took photos of him handcuffed until he made it to the French police station. But that's what happened to Dominique Strauss-Kahn. The French were not saying that he didn't commit a crime. They don't know. But this is what they said. We would never allow anyone to have a perp walk, because if you're innocent until you're proven guilty, you should never be put in a position of such humiliation. If you're presumptively innocent, that's what the French think. They're right. If you're presumptively innocent, you should not have to experience something like that. But here, you know, we treat it as, of course, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, freedom, instead of thinking about, yeah, but at what cost? What kind of cost do we have? I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes and we'll take some questions. Let me just say a couple things. Even though we said, you know, it looks like no bets are off in the United States about speech, that's not true, right? Because yes, Nazis can march, right? But you can't read the N-word, right? Remember, that's an interesting paradox that I'd like to leave with you. But there are rules anyway. It's not unlimited. Free speech is not unlimited. There are already rules. For instance, you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. You can shout fire in an uncrowded theater, but you'd be crazy. But you can't do that for obvious reasons. The police powers of the state have the right to not let you cause a stampede in such an instance. You don't have free speech in classrooms to just raise your hand and start talking and interrupting. You don't have free speech in a courtroom to get up and start making a speech. You're out of order. Remember, judge bangs the gavel. So it's not like we don't understand that there are some moments, instances, what I would call moments of decorum, right? The decorum of a courtroom, the decorum of a place where out of a sense of decorum and mutual respect, that you just don't have the right to just get up and do that. So it's not like when people say, well, the reason we allow the Nazis to do this because we have an unlimited understanding of free speech, but we don't. We don't in that sense where we have different categories like obscenity is carved out of free speech, libel and defamation. You don't have the right to libel someone or defame someone and say, I have a free speech right to do that. You don't have the right to what the term of art is the incitement of imminent lawlessness. You don't have a right to make a speech. I can't make a speech in southeastern Pennsylvania and say, let's all go off and attack all the people from Penn State. Let's just go get them. Let's go beat up on the Penn State people. Let's go across the state. And even if I go home and start, unwinding and you all go off to beat someone up, I'm not protected by that because that's the incitement of imminent law. I set you in motion to commit these acts. And by the way, we also have something called the fighting words statute, which we don't use enough. Fighting words is also a category that's carved out of the free speech clause of the First Amendment that says if I'm saying something that has absolutely no value, it's like low value speech, and there's no ideas in base, and its purpose is really to get you to want to punch me. It's that offensive that you would want to hit me back. Then it's a fighting word, and it's not something that we would think should be protected. Why? Because what the founding fathers were thinking of is a marketplace of ideas, and we live in a country where we almost assume that everything out of the mouth of a lunatic is an idea, and it's not. And we should not be uncomfortable with saying that's not an idea. If you have an idea, you can write an op-ed, you can hand out leaflets, there's things that you could do, but what you're doing is an act of violence. What you are doing is causing harm. And you're going to say, well, how do you know that? I said, well, I'm Bane Rosenbaum, I know things. But it's more than that. The book is filled with a lot of science and medicine. Several chapters discuss it. Remember the old children's rhyme, sticks and stones could break my bones, but names will never hurt me? Well, first of all, isn't it absurd that our entire First Amendment is based on a children's rhyme? Aren't you embarrassed? I'm embarrassed. Really? That's it? That's what we're holding out? Names don't hurt, only sticks and stones. The legal system cares if you get hit with a stick or a stone, you leave a bruise, there's a mark, there's an injury, you show a bill, boom, you can be compensated, you could be treated, you could have a civil case, you have a criminal case, there's a battery, it could be a tort, but names, right, could not. Well, first of all, my book isn't really talking about name calling. I'm talking about actual harm. I don't think insulting is the same thing as actual harm. Insults are fine. Even being offended is fine. You can be offended. But what I do know, and the book speaks about this directly, is that the science today of neuroscience, where they hook people up to PET scans and brain scans, they've determined that it's not just through pervasive indignity, shame, humiliation, discrimination, hostility. If you are perpetually subjected to these kinds of indignities, not only we know this from brain scans, it's not just that it leads to emotional harm, it leads to physical harm. The evidence is overwhelming now. It leads to types of inflammation that make you sick. It's not even just, oh yeah, how do we know that the person is emotionally upset? Well, you do know. I remember a student many years ago said in my class, I quote her all the time. She said, we sit on juries all the time, or asked to sit on juries, where we're supposed to determine the facts of a vicious car accident. And most people have never been in a vicious car accident. They have no experience with that. And yet, 12 members of a jury have to decide what happened and who is at fault. And then she paused and she said the following wise words. She says, but everyone's been humiliated. Everyone knows what that's like. We may not know about a car wreck, but we know about this. And so we shouldn't pretend, that we don't know. We do know. And if the science is now in fact demonstrating that there's actual harm, not just in the emotional realm, but in the physical health realm, that we should take that more seriously. And that we should treat these acts not as speech, treat them as non-speech, not entitled to First Amendment safeguards at all, recognized for what they are, harm-producing, their actions taken for the purposes of driving people of their sense of, depriving them of their dignity, humanity, and their sense of citizenship. You can't very well be thinking of yourself as a citizen if the obligation is on you to go to the public square, to fight for your existence, to argue in a debate that I'm a human being too. Really? Is that what you think people should be obligated to do? To say, yes, I know I'm Hispanic. Yes, I know I'm Muslim. Yes, I know I'm Jewish, but I have my rights to be treated like a human being. And I'm going to debate you on that? You know, we base this marketplace ideas on some fallacy, which is why we don't want to regulate speech. You know, as you know, based on my title, the book, Saving Free Speech from Itself, I'm in favor of some modest regulation. By the way, after what we saw last week, I talk about this a lot in the book with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. I think I can't believe that we haven't been regulating Facebook and YouTube and Twitter from the very beginning. You know who else wouldn't put up with it? The Europeans. They're also a liberal democracy. There's no difference between us. We have the same founding principles. They don't put up with this, right? They hold Facebook and Twitter and YouTube accountable for the ways in which their use of their platforms cause harm. The fact that the Boston Marathon bombers, the Tsarnaev brothers, learned how to make a bomb in their kitchen off YouTube, the Europeans think we're clowns, that we would actually think that that's something that should be protected. That would never happen in Europe. They have very stringent rules to protect against this very thing. Things that are there to incite violence. Major Hassan in Fort Hood, who had been watching all the radicalizing sermons from al-Awlaki, former American citizen who, was eventually subjected to assassination, but he had left a lot of really interesting YouTube videos around that radicalized people, and the Fort Hood murderer, that's what prompted him, and that was on YouTube. And so, again, the Europeans see this very differently. And what I was saying before about the marketplace of ideas is that it's based on, that's my last thought, and then take some questions. It's based on some principle that we got both from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes and Justice Louis Brandeis. Two different ideas, but they're merged together, which is that the reason we don't regulate speech is because there's good ideas and bad ideas, and over time, the good ideas will cancel out the bad ideas, which is like having the faith in an unregulated capitalist market, right? But we know we regulate our financial markets also. We don't let them be unfettered, unregulated. Here, when it comes to speech, we treat it like it cannot be regulated. And yet we recognize that there are failings in other markets that require some reasonable regulation. But here, there's just simply too much fear. My God, I can't let the government be in any way in the business of censoring my speech. But the answer to that's a fallacy, isn't it? That good ideas cancel out bad ideas. There's almost no truth to that. You know how I know that? Nazis. If the Holocaust, at the end of the Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials and the victory of the Allied parties didn't prove that Nazism is ideas that had lost, then why do we still have Nazis, right? If there was a perfect marketplace of buying and selling, I would think that World War II and the Holocaust and all the history books and documentaries and feature films and memoirs that have talked about that evil would have said, well, nobody would accept those ideas. They've been trounced in the marketplace of ideas. It's a fallacy. The marketplace of ideas are like vampires. They just come back, and it would require something else, a commitment by our country to stand up for each other and not allow words to become acts of intimidation and violence. Thank you so much. There we go, Amanda. Nice timing.
Thank you so much. This was great. We have a lot of great questions coming in. I'm gonna go back to something that you finished with, which was social media. We have been doing an anti-Semitism series here at the JCC. we've had a couple of speakers. We had Ira Foreman rather, a couple weeks ago, and we talked about, you know, anti-Semitic, Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism, and he very much stood by the First Amendment and said, you know, it's up to these social media platforms. And then last week, Facebook, Twitter announced that they were going to remove Holocaust denial and remove some other inappropriate speech. Most people were happy, but there has been some backlash. I've seen it online on Facebook that people are saying, you're taking away my First Amendment right to say things. So we have a question from the audience. Do you feel that these online platforms like Facebook and Twitter are not allowing ourselves to express ourselves feeling freely? And what are your thoughts on how the First Amendment plays into that?
I'm sorry to interrupt. First of all, Ira and I don't agree on a lot of things. So if you would have told Ira we have Thane in a couple of weeks ago, oh God. So yeah, I'm not surprised to hear that. I'm sure Ira would have had some interesting things to say about his friend Thane. Well, those are two different questions that you're asking, because the truth is that there is censorship on these platforms, because we learned that last week with the Hunter Biden story, right? They have their finger on the scale. The algorithm is designed to push. This is why I argue when they go, you can't regulate Facebook because it's like the public square. I said, oh, really? No, in the public square, there's no way to stop me from talking. Nobody stops me. If I come, I raise my hand, I get a chance to talk. Facebook decides on your page what you get to see, right? I always still wonder, why do I only see what I see? How come I have almost 5,000 friends? I'm not that popular, but I happen to have a lot of people on my Facebook. You can look, I have a very active Facebook page. But honestly, I only see the same 60 people all the time. So someone's rigging my system. They've decided who I get to hear, who gets to see what Thane wrote. So it's not, in that regard, again, there is clear censorship. They're manipulating the algorithms to present ideas. In some instances, like what we saw with, there was a story I just read the other day about a Facebook employee, I can't remember where I read it, where, you know, anonymously went to a reporter and said that he was embarrassed by what happened last week, but he knows that this is what we are. He said, our system is totally woke, meaning they're just like universities. You know, if it's a conservative idea and it doesn't have a woke sensibility about racial justice and the response, white atonement, and all the things that you have to, all the catechisms you have to say in order to get invited to anything anymore, then we don't really give you a voice on Facebook. We only let a few people see you. So that's what I'm saying. I often wonder, you know, I'm a liberal Democrat because I'm a real liberal, but oftentimes people accuse me of writing conservative things. I'm always assuming that Facebook has decided there are going to be people who don't get to see Bane Rosenbaum because we don't like what he says. So that's there. On the other hand, when it comes to, you know, I mean, you know, Mark Zuckerberg, remember, he didn't go to college. It's very important. That's an example. The big problem when you don't go to college, you say stupid things. So here's what he said a couple of years ago. It's pretty stupid. If I was his parents, I would be really embarrassed, in part because he's Jewish. And no Jew in my mind would say something this stupid. That's what, you know, he didn't finish college. It's a problem. Hasn't read enough books. He said, we don't regulate Holocaust deniers. We don't kick them off our platform. I know there's a new change that's seemingly coming. But for years, he claimed that we don't. Why? Are you ready for this? Is everyone sitting down? There's never been a bigger boneheaded sentence. He said, we don't punish people for not knowing the facts, for simply not knowing the full story. He thinks that neo-Nazis don't read books, and that's the problem, that they would love Jews, that they just don't have their facts straight. He's that stupid that he doesn't understand what neo-Nazis are out for. He thinks they just simply haven't read enough. And if they read enough, or if they spoke to more people, they would be better informed. He used the words that poorly informed. And so there's an example of where, on one hand, he's got free speech going in a ridiculous direction, like I said before, typical of the American government, but atypical of Europe, right? On the other hand, the algorithm is rigged to make sure that there's certain things most people won't get to hear. So I think both things are happening with respect to social media, neither of which are good.
Thank you. Our next question comes from one of our library partners. She says, I was in a Zoom conference today sponsored by the Pennsylvania Library Association. They addressed the legal opinion that hate speech posted on a library social media site is protected speech, and banning the user, deleting or hiding the comments could potentially open up a library to litigation. We'll be meeting with our attorneys to study this and revise our social media policy. Can you speak on this?
I can. Uh, I'm sorry to say that that was the decision. This is a museum. What was this? A library from
A library,
what?
public library.
A public. Okay. So the problem there is the word public, right? And that's where the legal problem comes. Because the word public, that's why I said for some reason, if it's a private university, right? University of Pennsylvania library, I might have had a different legal opinion. It still wouldn't matter that much, but a public library is obligated to follow the constitutional amendments. So it's as if the government is stopping you. So this viewer is right when she says, we're worried that we would be treated like the government for censoring someone. We would, because tax dollars pay, you would be treated like that. So yes, if you went to your lawyer and if he or she was good, he would tell you, right, that could be exposed, you could be exposed to a lawsuit. Again, I'm not sure what the damages for that would be. You're not arresting anybody. You're simply deplatforming. They're saying, we don't showcase this. I would hope that this library, your library, would fight the good fight. A number of years ago at the University of Oklahoma, right? University of Oklahoma, what does that mean? State school, obligated to follow the First Amendment. There was a few frat boys walking around campus, and they saw some African Americans, and they were frat boys, and they started singing a song. I don't know the song, I wouldn't sing it, but the purpose of the song was to say, we should be putting a noose around the neck of African Americans. That was the song. Some, really brilliant Deep South song. And that I don't even know if they were drunk. They're just, that malicious that they would sing that kind of song. So the next day, the president of the university suspended the kids, kicked them out of school, and kicked off the frat house. Basically called the national chapter and said, take a hike, you don't belong here. You know what? I don't know whatever happened there, but he violated the First Amendment. I'm so happy that he did. I'm sure that if the frat boys and the frat wanted to fight this back, I don't know, maybe they're back, but that is a violation of the First Amendment for this reason. I would hope that they would have fought the good fight under the principles that I raise in my book, but I'm just giving you a parallel to what your librarian would see similar, right? That in a way, these boys would say, you can't stop me from singing this song. Not in a state school. And you can't kick me out because my parents pay taxes in the state of Oklahoma. I don't know. I don't want to know what happened to them. Maybe someone will look this up. Maybe the librarian will look it up. It'll be nice symmetry. Did you get muted?
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
A question or comment about our founding fathers. So it says John Adams did get the
Yes, I saw that. Yeah, I like that. Whoever wrote that, it's very smart. He's right. He's right. I would still say that I would have put John Adams in that category. Remember, John Adams was not really a drafter of the Constitution. So my line would have been smarter if I had simply said Madison and Hamilton, because they were really the principal architects. John Adams, I believe, was an ambassador to England at the time. So he really wasn't that involved. And then, of course, he had such creepy Republican principles. He sort of had, Donald Trump and he would have had some things in common, actually, oddly enough. He had some authoritarian principles, so I'm not surprised. But let me just say something about the Sedition Act, which is your viewer said, hey, what about the Sedition Act? Most Americans agreed with that. It wasn't until the 1960s that we got crazy about the First Amendment. For the first 50 years of our, 180 years of our country, there was all kinds of restrictions on free speech, all the time. The civil liberties of the 1960s, civil rights, civil liberties, also ushered in a whole new series of cases that gave voice to the First Amendment in ways that we did not know before. Remember, I mean, You know, there are all kinds of examples. Abraham Lincoln declared end of habeas corpus during the Civil War. We've had lots of examples of our famous leaders who took positions that were antithetical to free speech.
Thank you. I'm just going to remind people, here's the book. In the chat is a link to purchase a signed copy. One of the sections that I found really fascinating when I was reading was when you spoke about hate speech and hate crimes. I was wondering if you could kind of explain some of that for our audience.
Yeah, it's an interesting, I'm glad that you singled that out, because that's not, it's in the book, but I wouldn't say that I illuminated it. I didn't highlight it. So way to go, Amanda. Nicely done. So you heard me say that, you know, the European countries, I didn't actually say it specifically. I said things that we would tolerate, they wouldn't put up with. And what that essentially is, yes, they have rules, because what I said before, human dignity, right? Statutes that would say what you've just done violates the principles of dignity and human rights and hate speech. So hate speech is collapsed in Europe with the dignity arguments and the human rights. So that's how they understand it. We don't do this. We believe in unfettered free speech, right? So we don't, but we do have something called hate crimes. So hate crimes work in a very different way. It's not really about, it's only there as an add-on. The speech is not really the central point. In hate crimes, if I go chase down an African-American with a baseball bat, screaming the N-word the whole time, and then pound away at him, and I am arrested for assault and battery and attempted murder and everything that I should be arrested for, right? And then someone says, oh yeah, but by the way, you know, he happened to say the word N-word. And it's, really? We can tack on additional penalties because now it's become a hate crime. Now, there are people who argue, well, wait a minute, I thought we have a country of free speech. I should be punished for my crime, but I shouldn't be punished for what I said while I was committing the crime. Obviously, Amanda, I don't agree with that. I think you should be punished for what you said. But you can understand the argument when people get punished doubly, you know, whatever it is, an additional 10 years, 5 years, when it's jacked up to a hate crime, right? People would say, well, aren't you essentially aren't you essentially calling it hate speech? And we're saying, no. The underlying crime is the battery, the arson, whatever it is. You know, like for instance, burning down someone's house and leaving a sign that says, get out Jews, right? So now you have arson, but you have a hate crime. So you can add on. So it's really not really hate speech, but even though you could make the argument, and it is, and trust me, many criminal defense lawyers have made that argument. It violates the First Amendment. My client can say whatever the hell he wants while he's using a baseball bat, and you can punish him for using the baseball bat.
Thank you. Does anybody have any other questions? I don't see anything else coming in. I do find it fascinating, the human dignity portion, that, you know, Europe has this whole other, and not only European country, but Israel and other places that have, I think Australia maybe, that have dignity built into.
Brazil.
They're funny.
They're not only just good dancers, they have that too. You know, I mean, yeah, I mean, I just think this is bizarre that when I say this, sorry to interrupt you, when people say, what? Thomas Jefferson never put the word dignity? No, sorry. James Madison didn't put it in the Constitution? No. Nobody thought to put that in. And I consider that a fundamental right. I don't see why it's any less or more so than speech. I think it's combined in many ways with speech. Why? Oh, thank you for reminding me of something. If you read the correspondence between the founding fathers when they were drafting the Constitution, Amanda, you see something that's fascinating. And I picked this up, it's in the book, it's all throughout the book, where they say, free speech was their last right in the First Amendment. They were mostly interested in freedom of the press and freedom of assembly. Speech was like the afterthought. State constitutions, Pennsylvania, by the way to go. Pennsylvania, I think Virginia, and I can't remember, maybe New York, pushed to say, oh, no, we also have to have freedom to speak, right? This comes out of you guys. Pennsylvania mostly drove this because your constitution had it. Your state constitution had it, but the federal constitution was being developed and did. So when the founding fathers reluctantly tossed it, or not reluctantly, they added it in after religion and press and assembly and association, the letters between them said the following things. Of course you should have freedom of speech, but not, as long as it doesn't conflict with others, the rights of others. Think about that. Saying it doesn't blow everyone else away, right? And what we've done is we've created a situation where we say it is the key right. It's the only, everyone knows about freedom of speech, right? They don't really know about the other, like this is the number one, if you're gonna name, what's the most popular, amendment to the concept, freedom of speech. So everyone believes in it. They talk about it. As I said, there's a lot of contradiction and hypocrisy, which is how I started today's talk about, well, do we really believe in, free speech? Because it doesn't seem like it. But again, why did we treat it eventually that it trumps, it supersedes, it runs over everyone else's rights? The right of a lunatic speaker overrides my right to just live in peace. That was the argument about the Holocaust survivors in Skokie, Illinois. It was very new. It was a shocking case at the time. The town tried to prevent the permit of the neo-Nazis. Oh, the thing that I don't know if people know, I should have said that Skokie, at the time, it's not true today. Remember, this was 1977, so it was only 30 years after the liberation of Auschwitz. It was really like yesterday. Think about how loaded, 32 years after Auschwitz. So they attempted to, no one ever did anything like this. Why did they go to Skokie? Because Skokie had the largest percentage of Holocaust survivors per capita in the country. For whatever reason, that suburb, whatever it was, had a huge number, and the Nazis knew exactly what they were doing. So that's why they wanted to go there. And so the town tried to stop them by denying them a permit. The ACLU stepped in and got them a permit. They have a First Amendment right to do this, right? And I remember there's a line in the court, the judge wrote in the Seventh Circuit something, again, I can't even believe it, without shame. He said, I understand that this is going to be very harmful to the people of Skokie. He gets it. He goes, but that's not, he literally, I think he says something, they should just stay home on that day. They shouldn't go outside. And that's why, we'll talk about one right destroying another's right? Literally acknowledging, saying, hey, well, no one's you can't interfere with the neo-Nazis' rights. No one's other rights matter. This right is the most important right. And you have people that are literally traumatized and saying, I did not move to the United States after surviving a death camp and having my entire family die. And all of a sudden, I'm told that my government, my taxpayers, they're going to let neo-Nazis come into my small little town. And most people, if you ask, I'm sure, look, most people reject what I'm saying. So I know that. But if you ask most people, I think they're lunatics. But if you ask them, they'll say, yes, that's what makes America great, that we would let the neo-Nazis do that to Holocaust survivors. And I would say, no, I don't think that makes us great. I don't think that's something we should be proud of. I think that makes us, I don't know what it is, but I'm not sure that that shows the virtue of what it means to be an American. Just like a country that had slavery allows the burning of a cross on an African American's lawn. Really? I would think one country that could not allow that would be us. So no, I don't think it makes us great, but I'm in the minority.
Thank you so much. We've had a great discussion. In conclusion, what kind of proactive steps, what would you kind of call for in the future, or public discussion or discourse about this?
Well, I think that having this discussion is important. The book was intended to start a conversation. This is a conversation that no one has. Everyone assumes what I just said. Of course, again, I'm pointing out hypocrisy that, well, we don't really mean it, right? And in fact, what your anecdote that one of your viewers asked about Facebook was a good example of a hypocrisy, right? On the one hand, oh, we couldn't possibly stop the neo-Nazis, but we can stop a conservative opinion that likes Donald Trump. It's like, what? Then that's not a fair platform. So I wanted to start a conversation that most people do not have, that they don't even know what it's about. I'm sure that most of what I've said to the audience, it's not their fault. Most of you had no idea about any of this stuff. It's not widely known. It's not. I know this because I've been teaching it and talking around the country, and people always go, "Well, I never thought of that before." And so, yes, we have the potential to introduce these ideas. We could put in a constitutional amendment that guarantees dignity. right? We have a constitutional amendment that created the right to privacy so women could have reproductive justice. We could have, we can create through case law the same principle that there's a implicit right to dignity, just like there's an implicit right to privacy. I would take that argument to the Supreme Court. That could be an argument. You could have another amendment to the Constitution, and there is case law that we're not using, specifically Chaplinsky versus the United States, that introduced the fighting word doctrine. Remember, I mentioned before, we said a case that said if speech has no step to the truth, it's there only, has no value. It's no value. It's just there to get someone to punch you back. That we don't treat that as it's protected under the First Amendment, but we don't use that case. Why don't we use that case, right? We could be making that argument. Why is Chaplinsky in the United States a case that we don't hear about, and why aren't we using it in this way? And it's mostly because we're free speech crazy, and we don't want the government to ever interfere with our speech.
Well, thank you so much for starting the conversation. I know I found the book completely fascinating. There's a lot of great things in it. In the chat is the link to buy the book. Thank you, Bane Rosenbaum, for joining us, and have a great night, everybody.